thank you for joining us this morning. We're going to be talking through a transformation of Thomas Cook's recruitment processes, specifically for retail. My name is Ben Smytheman. I head up one of the consulting teams at SHL. I'm delighted to be joined by Emily from Thomas Cook.
Hi everyone, I'm Emily Thorpe. I'm Head of Resourcing at Thomas Cook, so global travel business, around 22,000 employees globally, but today we're talking about the 6,500 that are in our retail network.
Okay, so we're going to keep doing this because we didn't want to get mic'd up, so we'll just be jumping back and forth, I'm afraid. So I'm conscious of time. We're going to fly through the presentation. We've got about 20 minutes. We will get into the key details, and then more than happy to have questions at the end, if that's okay, just so we can keep to the flow. I wanted to start just taking a little bit of a step back, really, and set the context for assessment and what we experience as SHL in the market. In today's quite volatile and uncertain times, talent actually is one of the most accessible and obvious levers an organisation can pull to increase business performance. Now, we know the reality is that although HR has got that opportunity, like many of you in the room have probably noticed, it's difficult to prove the ROI of those programmes. So if we want to get better at proving ROI, if we want to deliver outcomes, we fundamentally need to start with a more strategic approach. And this is what we're reflecting on the slide here. Now, the reality, again, is that although we want to deliver a strategic approach, actually often it's not working. And it wouldn't be an SHL presentation if I didn't throw a few statistics at you just to show that this ecosystem on the screen here is often quite disjointed. So we know at a solution level, if we're looking at the talent we bring into the business, less than half of applications typically meet requirements. When we zoom out a little bit, in terms of particularly your graduate populations, actually, a quarter of the graduates you'd have hired last year are already looking to leave you. We work with global organisations that are spending millions right now on redundancy payments and removing people from the business. They're simultaneously hiring tens of thousands of people. So when we think about the organisational strategy and how that feeds into talent, and particularly assessment, considering that we've got, people at 70% of our operating expenses, and there's over 3 million talent decisions being made every single day, this ultimately has to be a lot better lined up. Interesting, in particular from a recruitment perspective, we had a look at 1.6 million job postings that are online right now, and 90% of those are after the same 21 roles. So really interesting how competitive we're moving forward. So this on the screen, just to explain what it is SHL's strategic talent management model. I'm not going to go into all the detail, but it's ultimately there to help us work with our clients to look at the bookends of the process, to ensure fundamentally that any kind of assessment solution we put in place delivers outcomes, and they're outcomes that we can measure. SHL has, I guess, been in this business for over 45 years. We work in over 150 countries. We assess 50 million people each year. And this is something we really feel is really important in the market right now. Now, the last box on that slide was around measuring effectiveness. And I think, if I'm going to be really blunt, the assessment market in particular is quite immature here. Hands up of people who buy right now some form of psychometric or similar assessment or have it in place. Quite a lot of you. And the reality is, I think that most of the times that's done, it's bought by design. So we look at the art and we look at the science. We don't necessarily fundamentally look at the outcome that it's going to drive. So in line with that last graphic on measuring effectiveness, this is an architecture we've designed that helps us track that over time. And it's going to particularly play into the story we talk about today for Thomas Cook. So yes, we have the obvious, we look at diversity of talent that organisations are recruiting. We look at productivity and quality of hire. So incrementally, what kind of impact are those individuals having in the business? But there's also the slightly softer metrics. So participant engagement, how are they finding the process? Are they feeding that back to us and you on an annual basis? How are line managers getting on? Are they fundamentally on board for their business unit about what you've done? So at an organisational level, this and the measures we can attach to it allow you to show the ROI over time. At a business unit level, we get to understand how managers are finding the processes you put in place. For participants, they actually understand why they're fundamentally doing the assessment. And I know this is a recruitment event, but we can equally use this in development, particularly for things like high potential programs where individuals have a clear purpose going into that. So I think a big opportunity for me and why I wanted to present this is around talent trade-offs. So a lot of the clients I work with will, for example, start with an outcome in mind and maybe haven't got this wider peripheral view of what else they might be looking to achieve. So, for example, you go hell for leather on delivering efficiency, but you might do so in a way that's detrimental to the participant experience and also diversity. So this is a framework we've used as part of our conversation with Thomas Cook up front to ensure, one, we understand the organisational context, and secondly, we identify the outcomes and the measures we're going to show over time before we design the solution. And this is a critical thinking step in our process. But I have to say, all of this is a waste of time if as an organisation you don't necessarily know where you're at now. And I think one of the unique things that's been fantastic working with Emily and her team is they had a very good, clear view of their current baseline. So actually, what sort of outcomes are they starting with right now that we can then build on with our solution? So it's at this point that I'll let Emily talk you through a little bit about what that context was.
Thank you, Ben. Okay, so let's talk about the starting point. We knew that we had more and more applications year on year. It was working out in our retail network to be around 50 applications per role. So it was getting to the point where it's unmanageable, especially since the financial crisis. We were coming out of that. The economy was more buoyant. There was more and more jobs, more and more candidates. With that surge of candidates also came the challenge that they were less and less qualified. So we got a huge volume of candidates, but they weren't necessarily high volume suitable for the role. Our time to hire was increasing significantly. Many reasons behind that: the volume of candidates to sift, the amount of workload in our retail network, and so on and so forth, so increasing year on year. The process was really labour intensive. So like many businesses, we had screening questions in our applicant tracking system. So when you applied, you answered a number of questions, you might have got a percentage ranking depending on your answers, and we could sift out candidates on that basis, but not to the degree that we needed. We still had a really high volume going into the manager that they then had to do something with. That then resulted in candidates sitting in our system without any responses. So it might be that they were sent to the manager for review, they then sat in the system for a really long time until the manager had the ability to review that large volume of candidates and do something with them. Equally, they might invite them to interview and then have enough time to then review, provide all the feedback, complete the process. So we had issues at both stages. We knew that about 1 in 5 of our candidates was unhappy. So we reviewed things such as Glassdoor reviews, pulse surveys, feedback from management, and general feedback from candidates when we had the opportunity to give them a call. And they were posting about it on social media. So I talked about Glassdoor, but also our Facebook careers pages, our Instagram careers. People were making comments to say, this process is just taking a little bit too long, and it doesn't feel right for the size of the organisation. Our attrition was increasing. So buoyant labour market, people were leaving more and more, not necessarily due to the employer or the conditions, but within the market where there's so much competition, you expect, especially in a high volume retail network, that you will see that attrition increase. And hiring managers ultimately were frustrated with the quality of the candidates they were receiving. Like I said, high volumes, not necessarily a large number suited to the role. The other thing to note in our retail network is that we do operate a relatively self-service approach. So our stores manage their business themselves. So we would, as a recruitment team, provide them with the CVs that were sifted, but then the manager would have to manage the rest of that process. So inviting their candidates to the interviews using the system and providing the feedback, progressing the offer all the way through to when HR then pick up on contract with that individual. So a little bit of feedback that we received throughout the process. Like I say, we did a manager survey. So we received feedback from our managers directly. We also used Glassdoor reviews and social media posts, as well as verbatim candidate interactions. They were telling us interviews were just taking too long. Candidates were taking time off to come to our assessment process, but then they weren't hearing anything back. So candidates were frustrated that they had taken a day's annual leave, but then might not hear from us for weeks. In a really fast-moving labour market, we were then losing out. So even if we'd interviewed and really liked them, the lack of feedback and process from there meant we lost out on the candidates that we wanted also. So all of this coming together meant that we needed to do something for a majority, with a huge different amount of reasons that we knew we needed to do something differently. Also in our retail network, we also wanted to look at diversity. We knew that we hired a lot of females into our retail network, and we wanted to look at how do we increase diversity to match our customer base also. And we didn't quite know how to tackle that. So what's the business impact? So time being one of the major impacts that we had. It was taking too long to recruit, both from a manager perspective and from a recruiter perspective, and we attributed that to money based on salaries and the time taken. Candidates taking action against their candidate experience. So we know that if you have a poor candidate experience, you're less likely to engage with the brand itself, and therefore we could put that down to how much we might receive in terms of revenue from a holiday booking each year. And that number doesn't take into account the fact that those candidates could also tell their friends and family who might also choose not to purchase from us. So that's purely based on the candidate's experience alone. Time to hire was extended significantly, and we know how much each of our colleagues make in revenue per day. So again, we can attribute that back to how much lost revenue we have by the number of days it's taking to hire somebody into the business. We know if we cut that down by up to 2 weeks, we can make a significant amount of revenue. And then we have to think about culture and values. The people we were hiring weren't necessarily aligned to our values. Again, we had a high volume. How do you make sure in a dispersed retail network that those people culturally align to how we want to behave as a business, both in terms of our customer promises and the promises we make to our travelling customers, but also as a business and how we want to operate with each other. And all of that leading to a major impact, potentially, on our employer brand, which is the hard, intangible piece that we needed to look at and do something with. And back over to Ben.
Okay, so I think the business case was pretty clear for Thomas Cook, and as you can see, we had some really good measures up front of the current context. So I guess the obvious thing to do is then dive in and pull a solution together from what SHL has to offer. But I thought it'd be valuable to talk a little bit about the principles we take into account when designing that solution. And I'd really challenge you and encourage you, regardless of who you're working with, to think about some of these. So we often find ourselves, as I said earlier, to have some conflicting priorities. So you can see on the slide here, we're looking for things such as candidate experience, we're looking to drive an efficient solution, and we're also trying to deliver one that's effective. Now, I think the reality is most organisations struggle to meet all three of those. One might be slightly more of a priority than others, but inherently it's quite difficult because they all impact each other. So I'll talk through each of them in the way that we define them, and then some guidance going forward. So first of all, from an experience and what the participant is going through, we want them to be able to have informed decision making. We want to give them feedback. Ultimately, we want them to drive their own application. And some of the solutions we put in place for Thomas Cook that we'll show you really help empower the candidate quite early on in the process. There's lots of different types of assessment available. Some of the research we've done in the last couple of years, despite really the increased trends in technology, show that actually 10% of candidates want to go through something like a gamified assessment. They are happy to be assessed. They are happy to have the opportunity to be assessed. And most of them have reported that they're keen to have at least 20 minutes of assessment, which I think goes against some of maybe the grain that we're seeing more recently in marketing. So what's most critical to candidates is, yes, they get a good experience, but a good experience is not necessarily about the technology. A good experience is one where it's transparent, it's fair, and they get the impression that they can really genuinely show their performance and impact for the role up front. Secondly is the effectiveness. Now, SHL's the leader in talent measurement. We've worked with a number of different accreditations, so there's the British Psychological Society. As you can imagine, we are very fixed on providing very good and accurate data. There is no point doing any of this or even meeting the business case if ultimately the solution does not work. So what's absolutely critical for us is that we deploy assessments that can maintain a diverse candidate pool, provide accurate data, are legally defensible if you are challenged, and that's absolutely critical. And then finally, well, there's no point having a brilliant assessment process and something candidates love if it takes you multiple days and 1 million hours to deploy. So we work with our technology partners, and we'll feature some of this shortly, in the way that we can then integrate those products and technologies. So actually, how can we make the data quite hands-free? How can it feel quite seamless for recruiters, particularly the volume of people that Emily's been talking about? Now, you as buyers, I think, have more choice than ever before in the assessment market. We've seen something of a boom over the last couple of years. As I say, we have new technologies, things like gamification, even virtual reality. We have new ways of profiling individuals, such as strengths. And then we even have, the pretty much standard, accredited, tried and tested methodologies. But I would really ask you to think about all these three and how you can meet all of them and be confident of that before deploying a solution. Ultimately, being quite bold, if candidate experience out of these three is the only measure you're looking for, I think we would agree with Thomas Cook that we ultimately might not be the right partner for you, because that's not something we look to drive to the detriment of actually not having a tool that predicts behaviour and that we can defend well to both the candidates and for the organisation. So we recognise the three of these. They're ultimately all important, and these are the principles that we based our solution on. It's a foundation that we identified what were the different touch points to ensure that overall this was the best working design for Thomas Cook. And Emily's going to talk a little bit now about what that ended up looking like.
Okay, thank you. So, in true HR style, we gave our system a name, and because we're travel, it's Sunscreen. So we launched Sunscreen about a year ago now to our retail network. Many different reasons, as we've touched on before. So we wanted to automate that candidate experience. We wanted those queries and groans about the time it's taking to be seen to be removed from the process. We wanted it to be seamless, efficient, and we wanted to keep people engaged. We wanted to provide a realistic preview of the role. I think often in the travel industry, people think they're going to be jet-setting every 5 minutes to exotic destinations. So we wanted to be really clear on what the role involves, what kind of customer interaction is required, and ultimately, what are the key requirements of the job. And it was really key to us also that they understood that they were going to work in a really small, close-knit team. And they would have frequent interactions with customers that might be going there for years on end. So they develop really deep relationships with their customers. And it takes a certain type of person to want to work in that environment and also to be successful in that environment. We wanted to assess consistently. So across, again, a dispersed retail network, without having this tool in place, we couldn't track accurately that our managers were assessing people against our values. So we really wanted a process that we could complete that process up front and be assured that the candidates we're bringing in really do align with our values as a business. Reduce the time it took. I think we've gone over that. We wanted to compete against other large retailers. So as part of our business case for implementing this solution, we did look at what other large retailers are doing, not only in the travel industry, but across retail network, so we could be competitive. We really wanted to free up our line managers' time. We wanted them to be able to serve our customers and not spend their time wading through CVs. And ultimately, we wanted our vacancies to be filled faster, not only for candidate experience, for diversity, for our values, but also to drive revenue, which is critically important to any business.
Okay, so with the time we've got that is flying by, just thought we'd show you a little bit of a preview of the actual things we were able to put in place. So, as Emily said, the assessment process was end-to-end. So we're actually taking candidates all the way from attraction to onboarding. So there's multiple stages, but I think one of the key things here that it really was quite automated, and we put that in the title of the presentation, and there was no manual effort involved from any of the recruitment team. So although there are different steps, trying to remove the typical sort of hurdled approach where recruiters are having to duck in and out of different systems, etc. So it probably makes sense for me to reflect it back to the 3 E's that I had on the screen before. So from an engagement perspective, the first stage, even pre-registration, is a realistic job preview, as Emily said, and that's what's featured on the slide here. Something that's fully branded, an individual engages with. They get to tackle different types of job scenarios, and they instantly get feedback. So we're educating them up front as to the kind of challenges they're going to find in this role that might be unique, that we don't want them to discover a week, 2 weeks, 3 months into the job and then decide it's not right for them, especially with the time, cost and effort we're putting into the selection process. So the first touch point for any individual is to go through that and really immerse themselves into the Thomas Cook role and also the Thomas Cook culture. Moving on from that, in terms of effectiveness, as I said, we needed a solution that works. Yes, we want to engage those individuals, but we want to find a predictive measure of job performance. That ultimately is going to give us some measures over time to prove that this was a well-worked solution. So we combined a couple of different assessments here. So some looking at cognitive ability, others looking at judgment, and also personality, so styles working with customers. As I say, we assess about 50 million people each year. That gives us a fantastic database of talent, both in terms of items, so the actual tests you can take, but also those results over time. So we're able to access pre-validated content. So what that essentially means is it's content that's both been tried and tested for accuracy, but also proving performance. So it meant we designed the solution quicker, we got up to speed quicker, and we could have more confidence in the actual diagnostics we're putting in place. These weren't completely built from scratch, they were built on research and performance we've seen in the market. And then efficiency, as we've said, this was integrated, this was moving one step at a time, and it automatically progressed candidates. So uniquely, there was no administration that needed to happen once the candidate went through this. And I think the fact that they get to go through this attraction piece before doing the registration, which is typically the laborious application form, etc., is a really good way of maybe deflecting some of the candidates that aren't the right fit, but absolutely pulling in the ones you want, those that are applying for maybe the 10, 20 jobs out there in the marketplace. As Emily said, it was fully customised, both to the Thomas Cook behaviours, but also the branding. So what you see on the screen here is device optimised. This is what it looks like if you were to a candidate and go through it and click on the link right now. One of the things I said earlier on was around candidate feedback, and I think that's two-way. So as you go through the screens you'll see here, you actually get live feedback, but we're also asking candidates for their feedback. We're deploying a candidate advocacy survey, asking them what they think of the assessment, where it could be improved, what kind of frustrations they're finding, and that allows us year on year to contribute to improving this model over time. I think what's quite unique at SHL is we have a consulting support, both pre-build of the assessment and also post-build. So what's really critical to us is annually we're doing a review, we're looking at the measures we're seeing from this, we're reviewing candidate and line manager feedback, and we're actively making changes to really refine this over time. So there are some few more details I think Emily's going to talk through, and then finally, in the interest of time, we're just going to cover what the results are looking like 1 year in and take your questions.
Okay. I'll try and be brief.
That's right.
Okay. So, auto-progression, we've talked about it. The key thing to say here is recruiter intervention came out of that process. So we don't need to touch the process from the moment the candidate applies. The only point that we need to then review is when we get our sifted candidates back in, we can progress the preferred ones to manager review. And we've been able to offshore that process, removing the specialist recruiter intervention from the UK. And that is an administration process that can be done offshore. The recruiter can then spend their time adding more value to the business. So now our recruiter spends their time looking at locations with a significant number of vacancies, maybe running assessment centres, supporting with extra employer branding and social media in that region. So really, we've stepped up the gear in terms of what the recruiter can achieve for the manager. The hiring manager then, at the point they receive their candidates, has a really bespoke interview pack. So aligned to our values and behaviours, aligned to the candidate's feedback also. So they can have a much more thorough interview with that candidate, one stage, and then they can offer. It's disability friendly. So we know that there'll be people who can't always complete the assessments in the way that the standard process is, and we have processes to work around that and give extra time and do things differently. As Ben mentioned, we're getting candidate feedback, so it's part of the process also, but also manager feedback, so they can continually feed into the process and make things easier for us. And then integration, we use SuccessFactors, and the tool integrates seamlessly with that system, so when the candidate applies, they automatically are pushed into the assessment system, and they receive emails and notifications to keep them up to date on what the process is and what will be happening during their application and interview process. So, 1 year later, where are we? So 6,000 candidates have already been through the assessments. Our candidate engagement survey is underway, and also with our hiring manager survey. We know our performance ratings at the start point, we know our attrition rate, and we can measure the output of the process. Gender and ethnicity was really important to us, and there's zero adverse impact, so we really hope that we can then measure our diversity figures across the retail network going forward. We can monitor the time, we can monitor the cost, so we can see the improvements there in terms of revenue generation and the time it's taking our managers from application to offer. And we're also linking back that the measure and the feedback to NPS, which is our core customer metric as a business. So we can show business people in their own language what our candidates and customers are saying about our process. And you'll see there's an 80% decrease in the time it's taking managers to process their recruitment.